Okay, good morning, everyone. My name's Zach. I think in my conversations with my friends, I've been really surprised at how um, little people are using ChatGPT and other um, generative AI tools uh, relative to my experience, which is that ChatGPT can help you learn almost anything. And you certainly have to use your critical thinking skills to do that. But it's really incredible the stuff that you can learn, and I think it's such a useful tool that I wanted to make a video explaining or kind of walking through and documenting how I use it to kind of give you a sense of how you can repurpose it for anything. So today I'm watching this video from Karpathy, who's like some famous AI person, and he has this video about how to build GPT-2 in Python. So this is great because I know very, very little Python. I'm learning it with the help of ChatGPT, but I don't know hardly any of it. I also don't know hardly anything about AI/ML. I don't know anything about the complex math that I think is required by that. So we're going to go through and explain, kind of just document how I use ChatGPT, and hopefully this will give everyone else an idea of how to do that as well. So this video is supposed to be really good for understanding how GPT works. Um, I'm about 20 minutes in, which I'm just doing so that I'm learning along with you. Essentially, what we've done is we've created a Python. How GPT works is you get the model at a high level, I think, tokenizes, assigns like a number to different sets of letters or words, and then based on everything that comes before it, then predicts the next one. So it's obviously much more complex than that. We're going to learn about that, but you can kind of see we've kind of got the setup um, handled a little bit. So just going to dive right in, and I'll kind of narrate what I'm thinking about, how I'm thinking about how to build prompts, that kind of thing.
Why? Okay, so now that we have our batch of input that we'd like to feed into a transformer, let's start basically feeding this into neural networks. Now, we're going to start off with the simplest possible neural network, which in the case of language modeling, in my opinion, is the
So one thing right away that I'm a little bit confused by is the idea of a tensor. So to me, a tensor, I know the term is definitely related to machine learning. I also know it in the context of GPUs because when I used to play a lot of video games and looking at GPU reviews, the number of tensor cores was important. So what is a tensor? And then I'm also going to try to relate it to kind of the stuff that I know generally. But here it like looks like a matrix. So I'm not really sure what it means in this context. So this is Chat GPT. This is the front end interface. I actually recommend that you use other tools to query ChatGPT, in part because this has a rate limit. So hopefully we won't go over 50 messages in this session, but you can get around that with the API and things like that. For something like this, so when GPT gets trained, it's trained on like training data, obviously. Uh, in general, the difference between the models is that GPT-4, I find, is much more performant for complex questions, for understanding intent, and then um, like stuff that is less like deterministic. So like if you use it for therapy, like you probably want to use GPT-4. GPT 3.5 is really great for like, I mean, coding is really easy because it's just very deterministic, um, which means like there's probably a single clear, well-documented answer. Like you can think of like documentation, like that's great training data, as far as I understand. Or like asking a question about like Shakespeare, like that has a lot of documentation. So for AI/ML, I think this is probably something like a lot of it's going to be asking about Python and math, but I want to use GPT-4 because my knowledge of those subjects is not very high. Therefore, my questions might not be very good, my prompts might not be very good. So I want that extra kind of subtle intuition of GPT-4 over GPT 3.5. In general, I just always use GPT-4 because it's not that expensive. I think OpenAI ChatGPT Plus is incredibly underpriced at $20 per month. I would pay hundreds of dollars per month to use it. So let's talk about tensors. So I'm going to say you want to give the model context about what you're doing because again, it's trying to at a high level, I think what happens is like it tries, people say it's like autocomplete kind of, but it takes like the existing context and then predicts something. So I found that the more intuitive context you can feed, the better the answer is. If you need to change subjects, like let's say we're talking about balloons, and then we want to ask a question about like linear algebra, I find it's good to clearly say that you want it to tell you about linear algebra, or else it might try to connect things back, which is very helpful sometimes. Like if you're learning something, it can help you like explain how something new you're learning related to something it told you about earlier. But other times you want a clean break. So good to provide context. So let's just say um, I'm trying to learn about um, large language models, and I'm going to use the abbreviation LLMs from now on. Um, period. I'm watching a video from a renowned computer scientist that explains how to build an LLM in Python. They are actually building GPT-2. It's weird. It's like very uh, anthropomorphizing or whatever the word is. Like you feel like you're talking to someone. So it's kind of cool to say GPT-2. Um, period. Awesome. So there's the prompt. So at the beginning, I give context. That's really important. Second, um, I kind of give more context. This second sentence, I think, is a good practice where you tell the AI like what you're thinking about because it is really good about kind of understanding what you might be thinking about and then relate. If I just said, what is a tensor? I think I would get a worse response because it would just give me the programmatic dictionary definition of a tensor rather than helping me learn by analogizing what the reality is or what it's going to tell me back to kind of my context from the review videos. Um, so yeah, here let's see what he says. Okay, generalization of vectors and matrices to potentially higher dimensions. Okay, so it's like okay, interesting. So okay, let's just get through it and then we'll kind of talk about things to think about. Wow, this is big. Okay, so okay, a vector is an ordered array of numbers, which is a 2D grid. Okay, interesting. So I think there's a few things that I'm thinking about and that I want to ask a little bit more about. So first, I'm a little bit familiar with the math. I've because in the past I've like looked into this stuff and have kind of like asked about like what a vector is, like what a matrix is, all that kind of stuff. I took this math in high school, but that's like almost a decade ago, and so I need a little bit of refreshing for sure, or over a decade ago, I think. Um, so I'm just going to ask a question to confirm, which is, so essentially, a tensor is just a matrix of greater than two dimensions. Dimensions. Is that right? But right now, probably to keep things simple at the beginning, Karpathy is just using a two-dimension tensor. That's one question I'm going to ask. The second is that I'm going to ask for a high-level overview of how tensors and multidimensional matrices. I understand from just kind of general knowledge that machine learning has a lot to do with like matrix multiplication and all the complicated ways in which that happens. So I'm going to ask for like a very high-level overview of uh, how that all works. So I'm going to say, I understand that ML relies on a lot of complex math that often involves matrix, high-dimensional matrix such tensor multiplication. Soon have high school. Great. So I'm going to ask it. So I just want to get a roadmap of what I'm going to watch in the video. Again, this is why learning, like, you have like normal content, right? Like reading a book, reading an article, watching a video like this, supplementing it with AI, which is like a personalized teacher that can answer any question for you, is so useful. So I'm going to ask for um, just to kind of get a roadmap of where Karpathy is likely to go in this video to better understand kind of what's going on. And then I think I'm good on the GPU thing. But you can see that because I fed it this understanding of like how I thought about tensors and tensor cores in the context of GPUs, it explains it, like it explains what a tensor is, but then it goes back and answers kind of like it relates the information it already gave me with what I had given it. So it's really, really powerful for learning. Okay, great. So confirms my understanding, and asking for confirmation or repeating it back to the AI is really helpful for learning. And you can, if I'm reading too fast or whatever, you can pause this video and just read the prompts and the responses. Okay, so this is like so good, right? Like, so it starts with a linear regression, which is a kind of algorithm, and it's very intuitive how you can have like access the independent variable weight or height, and then you multiply that by a scalar, and you have a linear function. Like we've all done this in math, right? And so I think it's a really intuitive example how you can build that up into very complex functions with many, many, many different inputs, and you know get a mathematical response. It kind of intuitively helps me understand how math relates to machine learning, and why you would need to be good at math, all that kind of stuff. Because, presumably finding the formula or even doing the multiplication or checking stuff is really important. One thing that I am confused by is the difference between inputs and parameters. So let me see. Awesome. So just in the first half of this response, I think I'm getting a really good answer, a really good understanding of the inputs and the parameters model. And again, this example of a linear regression or a linear formula or uh, whatever linear formula is really helpful. And I understand the difference between inputs and parameters for sure. It's great too. I mean, it's scaling up, so it understands or it thinks that I understand the first part, and now it's teaching me about hyperparameters. Okay, very cool. All right, I feel like I understand inputs, parameters. I generally understand how matrices work or how tensor multiplication works. So let's keep going in the video.
Bigram language model. And we've covered the bigram language model in my Make More series in a lot of depth. And so here I'm going to sort of go faster, and let's just implement the PyTorch module directly that implements the bigram language model.
Awesome. So this is a great example of um, this is a great example of something that is really helpful with ChatGPT, right? So he's pasted in some Python code that he's already written, and he's gonna kind of rip through it. So what would help me to learn is to go through each each of the lines and understand exactly what each line is doing. So I'm actually going to go. I think he posts the yeah. So he's posted the code in the description. So we're just going to copy and paste it. Great. So it's a little bit edited for sure, but it's mostly there. So we're going to go to GPT. Okay, I'm going to say okay. So I'm going to paste the code in. I think it might be helpful if you label the code in the first line of the code block, budgets, and we return. So it's not quite right, but let me just grab this from the notebook. And like, look, the point here is to learn what's going on, right? So I want to. Okay, great. So yeah, so this is supposed to print in a code block, but I guess it didn't. Um, so obviously, so if I read the response, I know I'm not going to understand like anything. So what I'm going to do is like get a high level overview of where this code is going from GPT, and then go through and like dig in. So for example, I am new to Python. I don't really know what a class is. I kind of know I've taken some object-oriented programming in the past, so I kind of know what a class is, but I've never like defined one in yeah, it's been a while, all that kind of stuff. So I know some of this, but I don't certainly don't know all of it. So all this makes sense. Like again, like I know a little bit of Python, but not that much. Okay, so PyTorch is a library that helps you build neural networks, which has got to be really hard to build. Okay, so let's just stop at this very first bullet. Okay, so one thing that confuses me at the very first is I've used Python in the past, and importing a library makes sense. Importing, so first line makes sense. Importing a library as and then assigning it like a shortcut name like NN also makes sense. So for example, I've done import pandas as PD, right? So that allows you to call the library with an abbreviation. One thing that's confusing to me here is this third line. So this is just reading in English. It says like from this library, import something else as F. So I'm going to ask it. So one thing I'm confused is like I thought we already imported here. We already imported torch.nn. Like why do we need to import something that comes from torch.nn? Or can't we just reassign it? So I'm going to say um, let's slow down. So I want to indicate that I'm a little bit beginner. I understand the first two lines, but stuck on the third line. When the code says, okay, so let's break down this problem. So the first thing I think is this is an example of why I wanted to use GPT-4 for this. This prompt is not very well phrased. Ideally, I would go do some supplementary research. So I'd look up the torch.nn documentation. I'd look up like functional. I'd try to figure out a little bit on my own, and then I'd be able to craft like more clear prompts that are just straight questions. Here, I'm kind of just spitballing, like regurgitating or um, puking out everything that I'm thinking about, uh, and then asking GPT to interpret it for me. So so that's where GPT-4 I think really helps. It can kind of understand what exactly you're driving at and synthesize it with like kind of more reasonable questions. And again, this is like a very basic part of Python. Okay, so it's a module. So I didn't know that it's a module within, I guess, torch.nn is called a package. Okay, makes sense, makes sense. Okay, here, so this is really helpful. That I didn't know that. Okay, I thought if you import torch.nn, you import everything. Okay, see, so this is like such a good example of why GPT is awesome. Again, it's like as if you have your own teacher that can explain these things to you. here, so the second thing answers my question, which is that modules don't automatically get imported, or submodules. And then it goes on further to explain like why we would want to import functional. So, um, and then this, I think this is a great example of like the really incredible, mind-blowing generative AI, right? So it knows that I've asked it about parameters, right? And or maybe it doesn't know, whatever. It has the context of me asking about parameters and inputs. And so it'll say to me, it'll reference back to things that I've already learned as an example of things that are maintained in state. And I have already asked in another session about the difference between state and stateless things in the context of what the difference between a REST API is and a WebSocket API is. And I was very confused about that. So I have some background on what that is. So yeah, really, really good. Very cool. Torch.manual seed. Karpathy is explaining why he does that. It's so you can replicate the code. So, okay. So here's a line that I don't understand. Class, bigram language model. So again, I'm new to Python. I don't know what, I can tell that we're defining a new class, but I don't know what a class is, how it relates. So like I've done things where I've read Python code where people define new functions. I've never done it myself, or I have done it myself actually. So I'm going to ask it what a class is. Gotcha. That's really helpful. Let's move on to the next section. I see that the code defines a class, but I don't actually know what a class is. Can you explain what a class is in Python? Soon I have I took a Java course in high school, but barely remember anything. So let me just go back up to this section. So again, so one thing people know about ChatGPT is that it can hallucinate, so it can make things up. And we'll talk about that in a few seconds. But you have to use your critical thinking for understanding when a hallucination might be occurring, which is all the time, and then also like how you can combat that. So in this instance, what I'm thinking about kind of subconsciously is, for one, I generally have pretty high confidence that ChatGPT, especially GPT-4, does not hallucinate when it's explaining what, how uh, very mainstream Python packages work. And that's because the training data and the the training data about that subject is probably pretty copious and also very clear. So you can imagine that the training data probably includes the documentation itself, which should be very well laid out. If it's like a very famous project like PyTorch, like it's probably pretty well documented at this point. There's also probably a good amount of secondary literature about how to use PyTorch. There's a lot of code examples on Stack Exchange and papers, that kind of thing. So I am, and then it's all deterministic too, right? Because it's computer coding, like programming. Like it's there's an obvious right answer. There's a mechanistic way in which this stuff works, right? So at the beginning, the content that I'm asking about probably is not very prone to hallucinations. Okay. Second, for my application, which is like learning about something, let's say all this is like totally wrong, right? That only causes me problems when I start applying it. And I'll learn pretty quickly if I don't understand it well, and then I'll just relearn it, right? So there's no immediate consequence. It's not like I'm like gonna build something for NASA and like, oh yeah, sorry, I used GPT for my code and didn't check it, and yeah, like I don't actually know like that's not gonna happen, right? I'm just learning for myself, so the consequences are pretty low. if I were doing something like for work, then I might think to myself, like there was an instance in which in which I was using GPT for work. It was approved, and I was asking for it to classify different financial institutions into different categories. And it did a great job. It really saved me a lot of time. But I knew that when that work got to a point where it was going to have real impact rather than just the exploration phase, because we were just digging into data, if it ever got to a point where we were publishing or where it was going into a talking point or something like that, then I would need to go back and check, perhaps manually, uh, or in a more rigorous way, the classifications that were given for the subset of data that we're using. But that's still an efficiency save because I don't have to do everything manually. I can get to the exploration phase much faster, and then there's a verification phase at the end that might be more expensive than it was, but it saved me a lot of time. So you can kind of build, and that's like what I say, like if you read something on Wikipedia and then you put it into like a letter, then at some point, like if you're just trusting Wikipedia, like maybe you will make a mistake. And so you probably want to check it or corroborate it. So you just use the same critical thinking skills that you should be using every single day whenever you're consuming information that anyone is telling you. Here, another thing that can happen is this is like, I think this is not too long, but one thing to be careful of is like, does what they're saying to you make sense, right? So as I'm reading this next message, like it's a little bit unclear what it's saying. In the past, one thing that I've found is that when the context gets too long, ChatGPT can start to hallucinations are kind of more likely because they're and my reasoning or my intuition about why that's the case is because the context is so long that it kind of muddies the signal or it muddies the prompt such that the output is not very good, right? And so yeah, so that's another thing to look at. We have a good amount of context here, but it's only been like 10 messages, even though the messages are very, very long. Another thing that kind of gets me worried is like, it's not like we're talking about the weather or like meteorology. Like these are very technical things. It's a very like kind of jerky conversation in a way because there's like bullet points and code snippets and things like that. So I think that might also mess up the context. So I'm a little bit wary. Again, I'm using my critical thinking skills. I'm identifying things where I'm a little bit nervous about the output, and so I'm going to be a little more careful as I read this. Okay, and I've had that thought in my mind a while ago. So it's a code template for creating projects. I'll just have a number of variables. Okay, cool. So all that makes a lot of sense to me. Um, it's pretty straightforward, I think. One thing that is confusing is this sentence. So the first thing I'm going to ask is about what a constructor is. So I'm going to say, you said, so I'm going to reference a specific part of the response. is a constructor? Is it the line that defines the class, the new class, i.e. class dog? You also, and this is something that I wasn't sure about, you also use a definite article, the, for both constructor and class. Is there always a single constructor that is linked to a particular class? Okay, see, great. So I thought that this first line was the constructor of the class. But instead, I guess in Python, here, whenever you create a class, it sounds like you need to create a constructor method, which I guess makes sense. Like if you have a class, like you are always going to need to create an object of that class. And so interesting. And look, that's interesting because one thing I was thinking about when I read this was like, why would you name a function underscore underscore init underscore underscore? Like that's not very readable and it's not very usable. But then I should have noticed that in the code where you actually create a dog, you're doing dog and then just doing the name of the dog. And I look now and self appears to not be a customized variable, but is like a native variable or something like that. So the constructor method is called init. Great. Gotcha. This constructor takes one argument, right? So just the argument name, and then this is informative. Like, so there's self, which refers to the object being created. Gotcha. Awesome. Totally understand. Makes sense. Let's move on. Got it. So here. So now I can understand this, right? So I'm defining a bigram language model or bigram language model. And when I create an object, a bigram language model object, I need to seed it with a vocab size. Super init, super dot init. Okay, so let's go to the explanation that GPT has provided again. An embedding layer. Okay, okay, interesting. So this is definitely very complicated code, at least for me. But essentially, what I'm kind of understanding is that when you create an object of this class, it creates a tensor that has vocab size input dimensions and vocab size output dimensions. So that's so hard to visualize. I'm thinking of like a barbell kind of, where one side is inputs and one side is outputs. I know from having watched earlier that the vocab size is like 65 or something like that. And that is the number of tokens, number of different tokens there can be. So like A is 1, B is 2, C is 3, blah, blah. There's like period something. So that's a lot. I'm going to ask about this. So it hasn't covered this line, super.init. So I'm going to ask what that does. What does the Oh, interesting. So super is a way to call the init method of the parent class. Fascinating. Oh, okay. Oh, interesting. So in a way, because we're defining our own, so that must be a convention, is that when you create a subclass and you create your own init method, you call super.init to re-inherit the constructor method of the parent class. So again, like this is really helpful because I'm learning Python on my own, and so I don't have like a textbook or like a class where these like common conventions are laid out. So like when I look at code like this, whereas some people who kind of learned Python in a more linear way, they might be like, oh yeah, import libraries, got it. Oh, define class, got it. Oh yeah, do super in it. Okay, got it. Okay, this is the line I really want to focus on, right? I don't have that context, and so Python, this ChatGPT is really helpful because it's like a teacher who says, oh yeah, that's a common convention. That's like not something that's new or special or anything like that. Great, awesome. And then we create this embedding table, which I think is pretty intuitively named, and it's like a big matrix. So I'm gonna stop there. I think this video has gone on like really long. What I want people to take away, and like look, like how long did we get through? Like 35 seconds of Karpathy's video. So I'm trying to get through the whole thing. It's gonna take me a really long time. But what I want to emphasize to people is like you can do this for anything. I've done this for bank regulations. I've done this for wine tastings, like where the teacher will say, "Oh yeah, this wine was grown at 2,000 feet," and it's supposed to mean something to you, right? You could ask the teacher, of course, but that's not always possible, and so you can ask ChatGPT. You say like something like, "I'm in a wine class." The teacher said, and you just tell it what you know, right? And it'll help you understand these things. And seriously, it is a golden age of learning, in my opinion. And I think, and I've been surprised at how few people are using ChatGPT to learn things. And so I wanted to make this video to kind of walk through how I can approach something that I have no knowledge of. I don't know Python very well, and I know very little about machine learning. And yet, here's something that's going to create GPT-2, and I can work through it with the help of ChatGPT. It's really incredible. It would take me, I wouldn't even know where to start if it were anything else. So really happy. Feel free to reach out to me on Twitter if you have any questions. But certainly encourage all of you guys to start using GPT to learn whatever you want and to create new things. Thanks a lot.